Mackenzie, fertility and prenatal dietitian. A topic that I wanted to discuss is insulin resistance. This is something that's really big in the fertility and pregnancy field because it has a lot of impacts. It can be one of the root causes of folks' PCOS and their issues with becoming pregnant, or all of the symptoms of PCOS like high androgens and acne and hirsutism and all of that kind of stuff. And it's also an underlying factor in gestational diabetes, and might even have some fertility related issues outside of PCOS as well. And there's been talks about maybe even changing the PCOS criteria to include insulin resistance, because so many folks with PCOS do struggle with insulin resistance. So insulin resistance sounds scary. And I'm sure hearing that it could be the root cause of some of your fertility issues might bring up a lot of shame or guilt. Maybe you feel like you caused this, or perhaps it feels like you are destined to never get pregnant, or you have to be on a strict diet for the rest of your life. And I want you to know this. Number one, insulin resistance is absolutely nobody's fault. Insulin resistance happens for a wide variety of reasons. Most of them are genetic, and it's not something that's totally in our control. And I've got some good news too. There's lots of things that we can do with nutrition, with lifestyle, with supplements, and with medication to support your body with insulin resistance. And on top of that, all those things are completely within your power to decide what works and what doesn't work. Everybody's body is different. Everybody's experience is different. Everybody's going to have certain boundaries, mental health limitations to what works for them. And on top of that, there is evidence to support an intuitive eating approach for insulin resistance. There's been studies specifically on intuitive eating for gestational diabetes, if that's what we're dealing with. And there's also been studies on diabetes and intuitive eating outside of pregnancy. So we know that the intuitive eating approach does work. One of the reasons this does work is that it helps folks get out of the restrict binge cycle. And so this is what the restrictment cycle is, if you haven't heard of it. Basically, it's the idea that our bodies like to have a balance. They're always moving towards homeostasis, so some sort of regulation, whether that's with your body temperature, with the electrolytes, or the pH in your blood. And this happens with body weight too. Your body has no idea that you're trying to be smaller for any type of reason. It's just trying to survive. So when your body is underfueled, and we're in the restriction mindset, you can kind of think of this like a pendulum. And I'll use my headphone here as a pendulum swing. So let's say we are restricting, we're on a diet. Maybe we're even going low carb because our doctor recommended it for insulin resistance. So we're cutting out those carbs, and we're maybe even cutting out calories overall. We're all the way over here on the restriction side. We let go, we're gonna swing all the way over to that binge side because your body needs fuel. When we start to see overeating or binging while you're on a diet as your body getting what it needs, it can kind of like change our perspective a little bit. It can almost create a little bit of self-compassion, a little bit of understanding for why these behaviors might be happening, or why our bodies need to do this. Ultimately though, that binge restrict cycle is way worse for your blood sugar than being able to fuel your body with food in the first place. And so we actually see that insulin resistance can lead to increased carb cravings. And for folks with PCOS who are bombarded with diet culture recommendations and super restrictive nutrition approaches, we see them constantly being pulled over to that restrict side, and then those carb cravings, I'm pushing it. So we've got the pull of the restriction over here, and then we have the push of that insulin resistance. And so we're swinging back and forth. And so if you have PCOS or insulin resistant related fertility issues, you might feel totally out of control around certain types of food and feel like this is a willpower thing. And I think this is one of the most empowering parts about working with an intuitive eating approach for folks who have PCOS or insulin resistance, is that we get to talk about how it's freaking not your fault. This is biology at play. And so essentially, we can take a two-pronged approach here. We can stop dieting, number one. If we get rid of that restriction, and I'm just going to keep these headphones out here. If we don't have this restriction pulling us all the way over here and then swinging, and we don't have, and we're just dealing with the push. See, even that is already, we're still swinging a little bit, but we're already swinging way less. And that insulin resistance, like I said, is treatable. And if we treat it with an approach that is not restrictive, we're going to do so much better. It's going to be so much more sustainable. One issue that I have, even with some of the doctors that actually refer to me, is the recommendation for a low carb diet when they are diagnosing insulin resistance in their patients, or they're diagnosing gestational diabetes. In pregnancy specifically, we definitely do have to be a little bit more careful. We don't have to go the traditional high carb route for gestational diabetes, but we definitely don't want to be doing super low carb, because there's just so much more at play. So that's kind of a separate issue, a separate kind of video that I'll probably do at some point. But when we are talking about insulin resistance for fertility outside of pregnancy, there's a lot that we can do that's still not restrictive, and we can add things instead of taking them away. So we're looking at nutrition from a place of abundance instead of restriction. That said, a lot of people don't even know what insulin resistance actually is. So let me explain that for you. So first off, every time that you eat something with a carbohydrate, whether that's an apple, a cupcake, a piece of candy, a cup of soda, a cup of juice, that's all broken down in your digestive tract into glucose. And glucose is your body's primary source of energy. So we don't want to be completely eliminating carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are going to turn into glucose, which is your body's primary source of energy. And so if that is cut out, and maybe you've experienced this if you've been on keto or Atkins or whatever low carb approach, we often do see an increase in carb cravings when those carbs are totally cut out. So back to what insulin resistance actually is. Essentially, when you absorb the glucose, so it gets broken down from a carb into glucose, glucose is absorbed into your bloodstream. You can kind of think like of your bloodstream like a hallway, and there's a bunch of doors that lead into classrooms or offices. So all those glucose molecules, you can think of them like people. So maybe they're like students or employees at a really big company. They all had to get into those doors to do the thing, to do their job, to learn whatever we're going with here. When you have insulin resistance, all of the locks on those doors are rusty. And so if you didn't have insulin resistance, the doors would be locked and would be unlocked only when there were glucose people coming down the hallway at a rate that made sense for the glucose to get in and do its job. But if you have insulin resistance, the doors are rusty. The glucose people can't get in the door to do their job. So your pancreas, which produces insulin, and insulin is a hormone, it gets the signal that the glucose is not getting where it needs to go. Some alarms are going off, and it's like, oh crap, we got to do something about this. And it's a pretty rudimentary machine, so it just thinks we must need more keys. So it shoots out more insulin. And eventually this does do the job. Those doors do open, and the glucose people can get where they need to go. And this is why a lot of the time, if somebody has PCOS, they might it might be a little bit more difficult for them to get diagnosed with insulin resistance because perhaps their hemoglobin A1C looks okay or their fasting glucose looks okay. But if they were to perhaps do an oral glucose tolerance test, we might see insulin resistance show up for them. Eventually down the line, we might see some of those other markers as the body the systems just kind of start to wear down. We might see some of those markers become more elevated. But oftentimes at the point of fertility, so these kind of reproductive health years, when folks are in kind of their 20s, 30s, maybe even in their 40s, the body's still able to compensate. So anyways, the glucose people eventually get where they need to go. But unfortunately, those insulin keys, they can also turn on and turn off other things in your body, including sex hormones. And so this can affect fertility by messing with those sex hormone levels, and it can also cause those high androgens that we see that can result in acne and face and chest hair, and the loss of hair on the top of the head for folks with PCOS. And because the glucose is not immediately getting where it needs to go, it's kind of staying in the bloodstream a little bit too long. That can affect egg quality as well. So that's what's happening with insulin resistance. And like I said, there's things that we can do with nutrition in order to support the body to be able to handle carbohydrates. We do not have to eliminate carbohydrates. In fact, eliminating carbohydrates is going to be cutting out a bunch of food groups like fruits, whole grains, starchy vegetables, which all are a really great source of fiber and micronutrients. So we do not want to be completely cutting those out. What we can do is start adding things in. So working on increasing fiber, pairing those carbs with protein and fat to help slow the digestion down, which kind of acts like some traffic control and basically helps the body be able to handle the amount of glucose that's happening or that's being absorbed, because it's not a ton all at the same time. And then we can also support the body in working on inflammation through stress management and supplementation. We can also work on exercise, and exercise kind of makes your muscles into a sponge, which helps absorb the glucose completely independent of insulin. It's like its own separate key that works on a different door and can get the glucose people into where they need to go without having to rely on insulin. So that's really cool. But really, there's just like a more holistic approach here than just going low carb. And so that's what I work on with my clients. That's why I'm so passionate about the intuitive eating framework, because it's an approach to self-care that puts weight on the back burner and says, hey, when we try to control weight, things backfire. Things get more chaotic, and it might actually be worse for folks' mental and physical well-being in the long run. So what if we try something different? What if we focus a little bit more on behaviors that are actually in our control? And what if we look at your weight as just a teeny, 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 tiny part of your medical record? That maybe sometimes those fluctuations might tell us something about what's going on in your body, but it's not the end-all be-all of your health. And ultimately trying to control it, like I said, I don't find it to be a sustainable or ethical practice. So it's not something I do in my practice as a dietitian. So anyways, that's insulin resistance. I hope this video was really helpful for you. If you liked it, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Comment below. Let me know if you have questions. I'd absolutely love to hear your questions. And if you are looking for support in this, I am taking clients. I see folks one-on-one for PCOS. And then my program, Fully Nourished Pregnancy, is kind of set up to be able to support you as well. There's a couple extra interventions that I have not incorporated into that Fully Nourished Pregnancy program that are really helpful for people who have diabetes in pregnancy or PCOS. But maybe you're just kind of worried about this, or maybe you've had gestational diabetes before and you're hoping to prevent it, or at least make it easier for you to manage. And you maybe you'll rely on an in-network insurance covered resource if you do get gestational diabetes, but you want some intuitive eating support prior to that. My Fully Nourished Pregnancy program walks through how intuitive eating can work for pregnancy, all the foods that I recommend adding in for pregnancy. And on top of that, it does provide a mini lesson on gestational diabetes just to get you started and help you kind of look at it through a new lens. Fully Nourished Pregnancy, the approach I take is actually perfect for fertility as well. So maybe you've worked with a doctor or a naturopath or somebody else on supplementation and some other interventions for PCOS or fertility, and you just kind of want a little bit of a different, more non-diet approach. We'd absolutely love to have you in the program. We meet monthly on Zoom for a Q&A session. We've got a private Facebook group too. So anyways, like, subscribe, let me know if you have questions, and thanks so much for tuning in.